what about our current culture shapes that fear in a way that maybe hasn't existed in the past? What is a uniquely 2024 fear of death? And how is that different than the fear of death that you've spent your academic and artistic life curating?
It's a death without religion, honestly, and mythology or meaning. You know, I think that's what makes this time unique. I have not in my studies found any other time in history where a majority of the population, or a large portion of the population, let's say, believed that death was simply the end and that there was no meaning and that we didn't mean anything, right? Because God is dead for many of us, or we don't believe in that anymore. But for the vast, 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 vast majority of our ancestors, there was a spiritual understanding of life. And I think that is what creates meaning for many people.
This is the Buried in Work podcast, where we share tips and interview experts to help you simplify estate planning and end-of-life tasks.
Welcome to Buried in Work podcast. I'm your host, 𝘎𝙪𝙧𝙙. Today we have Joanna Ebenstein with us. She's an author, an artist, designer. There's a lot of... We're going to get through all of that. First of all, Joanna, thank you so much for spending some time with us, Buried in Work.
Thanks for having me. It's my pleasure.
I was thinking about this in the context of, we never know how much time we have left. And so I just, in the macabre tone that I am embracing for this conversation, I just want you to know how much I appreciate not only you spending some of the most precious resource that any of us has here with me right now for this, but also just that you've spent so much time curating and cultivating this to give meaning to an experience that we will all have, but that most of us spend a lot of time. I really appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Oh, that's really kind of you to say. Thank you. It is, as you can probably tell, it's a labor of love.
That is a perfect launching off point for how I wanted to begin, which is, how do you love death?
That's a great, no one's ever asked it to me quite like that. And the why is a question too. I mean, to say I love death might not be exactly how I would put it, but I think this material makes me passionate, and having conversations around this material makes me feel very good. And why that's the case, I can't say, but I can say from my time sitting in public spaces that I've arranged that are around death and speaking to people, when you're in a space where conversations around death are likely to occur, and you have a conversation around death, and you're nodding because I think you know what I mean. There's a sense when you have a conversation like that with another human being that really cuts through everything and is a real human connection. And I think I really love that feeling of a real human connection with someone else. And for me, there's nothing that takes you closer, more quickly there than to go into death. Everyone has a story. Everyone has an experience or a fear or something. And it's so essentially themselves that it's beyond persona. It's like soul to soul, human to human.
The mask really, even then I'm thinking of the metaphors here, but the mask comes off really when we're talking about something so intrinsic to our human experience, I would imagine.
Yes. Yeah. So intrinsic and something we all share, a fear we all share, a foreknowledge we all share. And that, many people have thought, and I would argue, that foreknowledge is what even creates the sense that life has such great value, is that it ends, right? So it's a part of all of our awareness, whether it's conscious or unconscious. That's a different question.
While people are still feeling, if they are like me, that kind of back of the neck prickle as we're having this conversation, let me take that and point them to your work online, which is at 𝑚orbidAnatomy.org. And also I know a book that you have that's really just out, which is Memento, Mori, the art of contemplating death to live a better life. And I'm so grateful for that. This is out. People can get this now. When we are contemplating this, when we're talking about that universal experience, the way you just said it a minute ago, that we have that foreknowledge, and you talked about fear. When you are creating art or writing your book, or what are the things that you are trying to include that are wide in that experience, the things that you know that people, whatever their cultural tradition, wherever they've come to, they're going to think about death. What are the widest parameters that you can set for talking about and making art about death?
Yeah, for me, at least as I'm understanding your question, I think the widest parameters for me are history. And, for me, that's my background. I studied intellectual history at college, and a historical lens onto looking at death in different times and places. That includes now, basically from prehistory to the present, helps for me to relativize fear of death and to relativize how we think about death in this particular time and place. So you'll see pretty quickly, if you start looking at the historical record, that as recently as the 1800s, right, death was a very visible part of everyday life. Women dressed in mourning, bodies were displayed in the home parlor. This is only 150 or so years ago, right? So to me, using that lens and thinking about how is it that we have gotten to this particular place? How is this different than it's been at different times in the past? Is this the inevitable way that it needs to be? Is this something that's just kind of a flash in the pan? Are we going to go back to other ways of thinking? That kind of larger cultural context for me helps me to look more critically at our own attitudes about death. And by critically, I don't mean necessarily negative. I just mean to see it as a product of the time and place we were born, with a culture we happen to be born into. If I'd been born 200 years ago, I'd be in full mourning probably if my husband died, So again, it's just, that's so much of it for me is the cultural aspect that we're born into and tend to see as inevitable unless you pull back and look at other times and places.
The metaphor that I always think about is, the fish don't know that they're in water kind of thing. It's like,
exactly.
We don't know that the way we think about death is really just now. The pH, the temperature has all been set by the water that we're all in, this cultural water that we're all in. And that brings me to where we are, kind of the bookend of the other side of this conversation is the work that we do at Buried in Work, which is, I think, a lot of it on the logistics side, but really just helping people kind of get through that hump of, I've got this to do. I don't want to be buried in work. I want to get through this. And I imagine that you have a lot to say about the cultural moment we're in right now and why that work is so much and so onerous and so emotionally poignant in ways that are different, I imagine, than even, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago.
Yeah, looking at history, I began to see that a lot changed around the late 19th into the early 20th century. That was what I studied at university too. I studied intellectual history of that time. And as I studied it, I began to think, oh, this is really the birth of our time. And I think right now we're transitioning to something else. So ask me in 50 years, I don't know what I would say. But right now, the culture that we're in is the same culture that was created in the early 20th century, and this kind of the end of the Victorians and the beginning of modernity, right? And what you have at that time is first of all, you have a lot of mass death. You have World War I, and then you have the influenza epidemic, which is even more pertinent now after we've gone through COVID, right? And you see almost nothing written about that. Even when you're reading the modernist writers, they're writing about World War I, but the influenza epidemic, no one really writes about. And many, many people were lost. So Western culture went through like this really intense 1-2, And then simultaneously, you have the development of hospitals. So there were hospitals before, but they were more like charitable institutions. And then it becomes a place where you go when you're sick and when you're trying to combat death, essentially. So you have death kind of disappearing. Until this time, death is taking place at home, surrounded by your loved ones, including your friends and family, including the children. This was seen as an appropriate kind of an important thing for children to be at. So you can see how much in 150 years, that idea has changed, right? And so then, in addition to that, you have something really interesting going on, which is the change over from a religious to a secular culture. And of course, that's not complete. There are still very religious people, and bless them, they're very lucky. But for many of us, we no longer have a belief system that explains why we die, where we go after we die. And so the scientific model is the assumption that death is simply an end. So I think the fear of death is also much greater because it's not kind of blended with this idea of heaven and hell and being able to communicate with your ancestors after they're gone in some way. Really, it's this idea of materialist science is it's over. That's it, right? Game over. Brain off, game over, which is actually a pretty terrifying thought. So I think you have this kind of perfect storm of all of these things. And then what they say is, in the 19th century, women were making all these incredible crafts to commemorate the dead. They were making things out of human hair. They were taking photos of the dead and putting them in the parlor. This all disappears because women also are going to the workforce, right? So because all the men are gone. So all of these things are happening at the same time. And to my understanding, like the number of deaths is just so great that the old systems cannot hold anymore. There isn't time to mourn the way they were when there's so many. If you imagine between World War I and the influenza epidemic, people dying, right?
I'm allowing myself to feel the things that I think sometimes I intellectualize. My background, I'm used to talking about a lot of things that are easier to intellectualize. I'm really trying in this conversation right now to feel the things and to kind of allow that cultural memory to pass between us as we're having this conversation. And I'm fascinated by these objects that you've just described. And I want to know, I know that a lot of the work that you've done in this study, this very academic study, has also been about curating and art. Can you just talk about some of the pieces that you've held, you've displayed, curated, and some of the ones that have really made a difference to you? Because I know that experience of I've never curated an art museum exhibit, but I know that feeling of finding something that really does speak to me and just allowing it to change, really just write a line in the register of my life.
Yeah.
Can you talk about some of those objects? Because
for sure.
They're gone in so many ways as you've described, and I want to know more about them.
Yeah. Well, I'll backtrack a little bit and say, the first time I really started thinking about death in the way that is now manifested through Morbid Anatomy and ultimately this book is I went to Europe for the first time after I graduated college. And I had studied intellectual history. I'd studied European history, but no one had talked about the kind of things that I saw in the churches and museums of Europe. And so I saw paintings of saints who had been decapitated, who were holding their heads up, pictures of whole fields of saints, in crucifixion scenes with dripping blood.
Right.
And then these objects that are called Memento Mori, which is what I named my book after. So I have a photo I took on that trip in 1994 of this very strange wax figure. It's about a foot long, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hyper real, and it depicts a decaying corpse that is also Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And so you lift the breastplate off, and
I grew up Catholic.
You grew up Catholic, so this is very familiar to you.
This is very familiar. You're a vote, but for the people who didn't, you will be shocked at the amount of detail that they've included in this wax figure that's just there in the middle of an otherwise very beautiful and not death-obsessed building.
Yeah, and the focus on the corpse, this like beautiful human corpse. And so growing up in suburban California, my introduction to death was like in the goth and heavy metal subcultures and horror movies. So I was into all that stuff, but seeing beauty mixed with death was something I had never even suspected. And I had studied art history in college and high school. My teachers never said a word about this tradition, but they filled the museums. They were everywhere. And so there are many other memento mori there. If you go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, they have this incredible ivory. It's a set of ivory rosary beads, and the center bead is you're nodding. I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. Half living, half dead centerpiece. And then all of these were meant for very wealthy people to contemplate their own death so they could live a life true to their own values, right? So that's like the older stuff, the kind of Baroque and beyond. But then in the 19th century, our first exhibition at the Morbid Anatomy Museum was called The Art of Mourning. And so we were really thinking about the intersections of art, beauty, and mourning. And what we showed in that exhibition, we had death masks. So death masks are when before photography, but then also long after photography. When someone died, people would take a plaster cast of their face and then make little copies of it, sometimes in bronze, sometimes in plaster that you could own. And so we had a few of those. We had memorial photographs. So from the beginning of photography until well, it seems like it's coming back now, but certainly up until the early 20th century, it was very, very common to take staged professional photos of the dead, often in poses that were called sleeping beauty, basically looking as if they were just asleep in bed. And there are many, many photographs. We worked with an amazing collector named Stanley Burns, who maybe you've heard of. He runs an archive where he specializes in these photos, and he very generously lent us many of them. And then we also had pieces of memorial jewelry. So people would make jewelry in the shapes of a dove ascending, which was to commemorate a soul, or clasped hands, which meant the everlasting bonds between the living and the dead, and in black, often in jet or other sort of black stone. And then you have hair art, which is probably my favorite. And so this is a tradition that goes back to the 18th century, but really was popular in the 19th century, where people would make objects and artworks and jewelry out of the hair of the beloved. And this could be the dead beloved, often was the dead beloved, but it could also be someone you were separated from or someone you had a strong bond with, and you just wanted a sentimental token of them. And we actually have at Morbid Anatomy a woman named Karen Bachman who kind of reverse engineered how the Victorians did it, and she teaches it for us. And I took that class.
Really?
Yes, really. And it's fantastic. And I took this class, and I was really struck by how difficult it is to work with human hair. You really need to concentrate. You need to go slow. It's a very finicky medium. And doing this for a long period of time, it was so meditative that I began to think, I think these mourning arts were also about mourning itself. You know, it was a way of like in a very quiet, gentle way, working with this material piece of your loved one in a way you have to go slow and you have to take your time. And then you have this beautiful object at the end, but I really think it's also about the process.
This is literally under the category of morbid fascination, so forgive the follow-up question, but would the hair traditionally be taken before or after the person had passed?
After, if you were commemorating the dead. But
Wow.
then there was also, like I said, a lot of stuff with the living, and there were even these family trees made out of hair. So while the family was alive, you see all these pieces and they're labeled, all these different colors. So you have the children, the adults, and the dead all woven together. They're if your listeners look up hair art and look on Google Images, you'll see incredible, incredible things.
Joanna Ebenstein is with me. Memento Mori is the book. MorbidAnatomy.org is the website. I'm 𝘎𝙪𝙧𝙚, and this is Buried in Work, the Buried in Work podcast. The way you've described this arc of this entrance into modernity and all the objects you've just described, I'm thinking about, we spend so much of our modern lives scrubbing and perfuming and clipping and doing things just to kind of denature, the kind of soft animal of ourselves. And yet I feel like whether it's the worn finger well of a rosary bead or the, brittle hair that has been intricately woven over time, there's this real understanding and appreciation of the kind of the grist and bone and just oil and grease of being a human being.
Yeah.
That is powerful stuff, and it is not in the culture right now. How do you deal with that disconnect when you're talking about something that is so present and then so absent?
I think it's a great point. I think we've become very uncomfortable with the materiality of the body, and maybe that is part of the reason why we've turned away from death, because it really does bring up unpleasant materialities too sometimes, right?
Sure.
Smells, or, watching the face of your loved one transform from a human to something that does not feel like them anymore. Yeah, and maybe there's a sense in which, because we don't really trust our own materiality, and other materiality makes us uncomfortable. That might be part of why death has moved off the stage a little bit as well.
Have you ever done or worked with like a death doula or someone in that capacity as part of how you're thinking about either the pieces that you're curating or creating or curating, or the work that you did for the book?
Yeah, for sure. So for the chapter is it just the chapter on grief? There were a few chapters of the book that I realized I wasn't really qualified to write without help. And so I did. So the Morbid Anatomy community is full of death doulas, which won't surprise you. And so I was friends with a lot of them. And so I interviewed them and asked them questions about what they would recommend people do and what they thought people most regretted on their deathbed. So I have the wisdom of death doulas. And also my husband, he is a death doula and also he has a lot of experience with meditation in India. So he's kind of bringing those two things together. He does
You
right
two
now
are like a Stygian power couple. That's like, I don't understand. I want to go to one of these parties that you're throwing. That's all I've decided from
come
this
to his weekly death meditation. They're fantastic and beloved. And so basically what he explains, which I think is super interesting, is that in the Indian tradition he studied in, embodiment is really seen as an opportunity to prepare for death. And so by becoming aware, meditation itself is to try to help you through the death process, because basically from this perspective, when you die, you leave the body, and this is like an unprecedented experience for us. And so this being able to stay calm in any circumstance is what meditation allows you. The ultimate circumstance being disembodiment and having to make the choices that will decide what your next destination is after death, right? So yeah, he does this for us every Sunday morning at this point, and they're really fantastic. And so yes, death doulas, and I would also just say, and I wonder if you feel the same, thank God for death doulas. Like I definitely, when I'm dying or sick, will make use of a death doula, whether that's my husband or someone else. I think what they're offering is amazing. There's this concept that I talk a lot about in the book called a psychopomp. And a psychopomp is literally, it's Greek for soul guide. And a soul guide is a figure that guides you from the end of this life into whatever is next. So in ancient Greece, Hermes was a god who would escort you, et cetera, et cetera. There are all these different psychopomps that could be animals, that could be deities. Also priests, of course, work as psychopomps. If you think of the last rites, right? And you think of shamans and rabbis and all of this. And I think that what's so beautiful about the death doula is they've taken over this role of being a psychopomp, but in a secular way.
Yeah.
You don't need to be religious to have the services of someone who will be by your side, who will help you prepare, who will help you be ready to let go. I think what they're doing is just incredible.
I have to ask, because you had the temerity to mention your own kind of end, as someone who's thought a lot about this, what do you want to include? What do you want to exclude? And how have you, given the nature of that process, how have you organized your thoughts?
Yeah.
And your emotions about something that obviously takes up not many of us get to do this in our professional time. This is mostly an off-clock experience for most, but this is really something that I imagine you've put in, kind of, you're in the top 1% of all people who've ever lived who've thought about how they're going to go.
I don't know about that. I'd say maybe in our era, I would say. But I think the Egyptians think of the Egyptians. They spent a lot of time thinking about how they were going to go, right? That's what the pyramids were about. That's
sure.
So for us, yes, probably today I'm one of the people who thinks about it the most. Well, first of all, I would say I have gotten so many great ideas so I started at the beginning of COVID. I started teaching a class at the beginning of lockdown, I should be more specific, teaching a class for Morbid Anatomy called Make Your Own Memento Mori, Befriending Death with Art, History, and Imagination. And I taught many, many iterations of this. And I worked with people around the world. And I got so many great ideas from my students. And one of my students was someone who had a terminal illness. And her final project was to create the room she wanted to die in. And she took a picture of it. And it was beautiful. And that really inspired me. So that's her idea that I've taken into my own life. I would love to create the room I want to die in. I don't want it to be in a hospital. I want to die at home with my friends and family. That's what I can tell you. That's what I feel very certain about. And I will say I don't want to have a traditional, I would say if my family members feel different, I think it's really, they trump it because it's really about their act of closure. But left to my own device, I would rather have a green burial of some sort, be buried in a forest and have my body decompose and become other life. That would be my preference.
Well, as someone who has spent a lot less time than you and yet has arrived at a similar conclusion, especially about the green burial, I only feel like I must be doing like I've done a lot less work and yet I'm getting to the same answer. So I can only hope that I've done a good job of looking at your paper during the exam.
I think it's a bigger thing, though. Let's look, go back to what we were saying about how much things have changed in the last 200 years. Embalming didn't even exist until around 1870, So I think this is a flash in the pan, and it's not good we know it's not good for the earth. We know it's not good for nature. I really feel there's something perverse about taking and taking and taking from nature and not even giving back in that final, where we could give our body, not even that, there's something so small-minded and petty about withholding the final gift that we could give back that could generate new life. So I think it's
fascinating, to talk about it in that context of like why. I want to ask about a way in which there's a socioeconomic component to this too, which is that you mentioned ancient Egyptians, this giving back. So much of what we know, and I imagine this has informed the scholarship part of what you've done, is about what happens to wealthy people. The pyramids aren't made for regular, Egyptian schmoes. I really struggled with the word there. But now we're thinking about it. There's a cultural awareness of all of these strata of how we want it. And for people who are thinking about buried in work, they know that wherever they're coming into this process, they have a lot of money, they have a little money, they have a lot of time, they have a little time. They don't want to get into a deep philosophical conversation, or they desperately do. They want to be able to enter this process and exit it and be better. They want to do a process and be better. How much has that democratization changed death? And how much do we know now about poor people and middle-class people dying that we just don't even know about anything older than, I'm guessing, 150 years ago?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the first thing I thought of when you asked that is thinking about the idea that we now have of a cemetery being a place of permanent interment, right? And
which is an American thing in some ways, right? Like that's not a European thing.
Well, I think it might have started in England. I can't remember anymore, but it's like definitely a Western world thing, and it's a recent thing. I want to say it's 1840s or 50s. And until then, unless you were very wealthy, to your point, unless you were pretty much a king or a queen or a noble person, you were just thrown into you were thrown to the churchyard, and then you were dug up to make room for new burials, right? And then those bones would be used to create these ossuaries or charnel houses, where I'm sure you've seen them in the Catholic world, right? That were anonymous.
This is one of the better things that we're known for.
I think it is a wonderful thing you're known for.
The art is pretty much, we could talk about the art all day long.
Oh, I think, and the death culture. I think Catholic death culture is pretty profoundly great. But yeah, this idea that normal people would even have a permanent interment is super new, so like the last 150 or so years, or 200 years, I guess we could say at this point. So again, I think people didn't, if you were a commoner in the Western world, I don't know about the East, but I will also say, like in the indigenous world, like I know that when the Spanish came to Mexico and tried to establish Catholicism, right, and abolish the old ways in the Mayan area that I live in the Yucatan, people would bury their dead under the thresholds of their homes, and they would continue to consult them as ancestors. And this was one of the main things the Spanish complained about, is that people were very, very resistant to the idea of putting them in cemeteries, and would actually go back, dig them up, and take them back home again because they felt they were lonely and in this cold and dark place. So I don't know about every culture, but I think probably a lot of indigenous cultures have a more personal relationship with the bones of the dead. They're not just in some space that they go and pray to once or visit with once in a while, that it's much closer to home.
I want to ask about this process and now, for people who are thinking about this from the perspective of their own future passing, or trying to advise a loved one who might be thinking about this. In many ways, the people who come to Buried in Work and have these questions kind of burned in the back of their mind with a lot of urgency, I imagine. What are some cultural or philosophical jumping off points? I think about, I had to officiate a friend's wedding recently, and before I did, just to kind of vent some steam, I watched the the Fleabag episode, the last episode of Fleabag that includes a wedding, and I was like, well, as long as I don't do some of those things, I'll be fine. I'm just, what are some launching off points that you would recommend for people who want to delve into this a little bit more intentionally?
Yeah. Well, first, I mean, that's really what I wrote the book to do. So I'll just say, the book that we're here to talk about today, when I had a bunch of early readers read it, and one of them is a Catholic historian of religions named Diana Pasulka. And when she responded, she said, what you've done is you've written a modern Book of the Dead. And so basically, what is a Book of the Dead? A Book of the Dead are books that have helped people navigate a good death experience, and I would say traditionally also a good afterlife experience. This is a secular version, right? So we're not talking about an afterlife. But basically, there were different times in history when these books were needed. So, for example, during the bubonic plague, when there were so many dying and there weren't enough priests to go around, and as you know from the Catholic tradition, right, to die properly in the Catholic tradition, you need to have the final rites by a priest. And when that couldn't happen, people began to produce these books. They were really popular books. Some of them were almost like comic books. They were for the illiterate that would tell you what to do without a priest in order to navigate a good a good death and afterlife experience. The Egyptian Book of the Dead is another example, and there's also the Tibetan Book of the Dead. So my book is really trying to provide, it's like a 12-week program that is meant to help people get over their fear of death and also help move towards what they think is a positive death, clarify what that is for them and move in that direction. And in that, I also draw on the wisdom of death doulas, as I mentioned. And what my husband would say is death doulas have this acronym they use, I think that's the right word, called RUGS, which is basically the things that hold people back from a good death can usually fall under these 4 categories. So R is regret, U is unfinished business, G is guilt, and S is shame. And so one of the jobs, of a death doula is to help people work through that. And so this book is also giving you prompts that will help you kind of at least start to think about those things and find a way to reconcile your life. And what a death doula also provides sometimes, which I think is really inspiring, and I make one of the prompts, is to create your own legacy project, which is a project that sums up your life as you see it, kind of it could be left for your loved ones. It could be for yourself. But I think these are beautiful things to do to help people see the bigger picture, and to forgive themselves. And to, I think so many people, again, without a religious tradition, and again, for those listeners who have a religious tradition, I envy you. It's wonderful, but for many of us in the modern world, we have to struggle and find our own meaning around something that culture has provided no meaning for, and yet it is something that each of us faces, right? With very little preparation, emotional or spiritual or even material, as you're dealing with your business, right? So that would be my advice: is trying to have an honest reckoning with yourself and start looking at what might be holding you back and what you might be afraid of. And that's, again, what this book is meant to do, is help you in a very gentle way through 12 weeks of reading, and then also writing these journal prompts and doing exercises, help you figure out, if you are afraid of death, what is that fear exactly? And how could one face that? Or how could one think about it differently? How one can prepare in, like I said, through kind of this way of dealing with psychology, but also there's a form in the back for filling out to leave to your next of kin that has, there's lots of practical advice as well. So there's all these things that you can do that I think can make you feel less anxious about it. Yeah, I hope it's hard for me to sum up, because it really is like the meat of the book is like 12 weeks of exactly that question.
Let me ask one final question about that fear and the anxiety, I think, around this, kind of how we began the conversation, and I'll end the same way, which is, what about our current culture shapes that fear in a way that maybe hasn't existed in the past? What is a uniquely 2024 fear of death, and how is that different than the fear of death that you've spent your academic and artistic life curating?
Well, I don't know if I could say it's 2024, but I could probably say the last 50 years, probably. And I think it's a death without religion, honestly, and mythology or meaning. I think that's what makes this time unique. I have not in my studies found any other time in history where a majority of the population, or a large portion of the population, let's say, believed that death was simply the end, and that there was no meaning, and that we didn't mean anything. right? Because God is dead for many of us, or we don't believe in that anymore. But for the vast, 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 vast majority of our ancestors, there was a spiritual understanding of life. And I think that is what creates meaning for many people. So another thing that I really draw heavily on this book is the work of Carl Jung, because I feel like he did a really beautiful job of bridging kind of the old ways of thinking into the modern age, into a more scientific perspective, but at the same time, acknowledging the importance of myth and belief and not ever knowing that that could be capital T true, but nevertheless living your life according to your beliefs and your myths. And so I think we're in a much more difficult time, and we all have to come up with our own meaning. And that's a big job. It takes time. Jung would say it took suffering, like that the answer you come to this question of what happens after death comes from your own suffering, your own struggles. And then ultimately you come up with your own answer. And again, that can't be proven in this world, but it can be lived into and died into and give your life meaning and death meaning.
I think about the creation of that meaning and the work that we all have to do, and how we live in a culture that is not just averse to that fear of death, but also very averse to suffering. We've tried to eliminate, just like we've tried to eliminate all the bad smells and ointments that come out of ourselves. We've also tried to eliminate so much, and it's, we consider it a great success as a society where we've eliminated, poverty for so many people and lifted, but there is a grist that is provided there that allows us to feel that satisfaction of meaning at the end of it. It is hard work. It feels hard because it is hard. And I'm so appreciative of the work that you've done, the curation, the scholarship, and this book, the book Memento Mori, The Art of Contemplating Death to Live a Better Life. Again, I would point people to 𝘿𝙤𝙙-𝙤𝙙-𝙤𝙤, which is your website. They can see some of the art there and a lot of the other work that you've worked on. Joanna, I really appreciate you. I desperately want an invite to one of your dinner parties to talk about death.
Next time you're in Mexico, let me know. We'll have you over.
But most importantly, I just thank you for providing a little bit of context for the place that we are both on this river right now. So I just really appreciate it.
And I just like to say one final thing, which is it is hard work, but what I've really tried to do with this book is also make it fun. It can be fun. If we can be open-minded and think of the mystery of death as both kind of astoundingly fascinating and terrifying, then at least we can have a different entry point. And so, it's not scary work. It doesn't need to be scary work to look at this stuff, in my opinion. At least that's what I've tried to do in the book, is make it gentle and fun. So that I just want to say that. Don't be scared. It's not that bad.
Well, it's actually, this is where the two missions really do dovetail, because whether it's Joanna Ebenstein and her book Memento Mori, or the Buried in Work website, which has, of course, not only the free resources, but also the games, the booklets, everything that you can provide. We want to make it easier. We want to make it fun if we can with the games, to have these really challenging conversations. I think this is one of the reasons why I'm so grateful for this, is that it does feel hand in glove, that what we're trying to do, although from very different perspectives, and hopefully people will come to either or both, and feel that as well. Again, the book Memento Mori, The Art of Contemplating Death to Live a Better Life, morbidanatomy.org. I'm 𝘿𝙬𝙧𝙚. This is Buried in Work. Thank you so much for spending some time with us, Joanna.
Oh, it was so much fun. Thanks so much for having me and for the great conversation. And thanks everyone for listening. I hope you enjoy.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Buried in Work podcast. Remember, you can save 10% on our estate preparation package and games with code podcast10 at 𝘿𝙤𝙙-𝙤𝙤-𝙤𝙤.com.